In order to truly understand Juana, Mexico's first female serial, we have to go back to the very beginning, mainly because Juana's childhood plays an incredibly important role in the decisions that she would make as an adult. Juana Barraza was born on December 27th, 1957, in a rural state just north of Mexico City. Juana's mother, Justa, gave birth to her when she was just 13 years old. Her father, a truck driver named Trinidad Barraza, had allegedly fathered at least 32 children with other women before meeting Justa. When Juana's mother became blindsided by this news, she packed up her things, her baby, and she left. But being a 13-year-old single mother would prove to be so much harder than expected, and she would soon find herself alone and broke. Eventually, being forced to go back to work at the brothel, where she met Juana's father for the very first time, she was also forced to keep Juana in a makeshift cot in the same exact bedroom that she would take her clients to for money. One of Juana's very first memories were when she was around 2 years old. She remembers sitting up in her crib and watching her mother on the bed with a client. She had her face in the pillow and she was crying uncontrollably as an old fat man was on top of her. Juana would have no choice but to become immune to the noises being made on a nightly basis by strange men in the room she shared with her mother above the bar at the brothel. Along with this, she would also witness her mother getting hit on occasion by these men. Once Juana turned 5 years old, her mother began making her hide under the bed, and she was instructed not to make any noise when her mother had a customer in the room. Imagine being 5 years old, hiding under a bed in a dirty room above a bar. Then imagine while you're laying under that bed, being instructed not to make a sound, you're forced to listen to thumping, heavy breathing, and squeaky mattress strings. This silence that she was forced into would follow Juana throughout her life, and eventually be where her new identity as a professional female wrestler would stem from. La Dama del Silencio, the Lady of Silence. This pattern would repeat itself for many years to come. Then, when Juana turned 10 years old, the owner of the brothel came to her mother with a plan to make a lot of money. But at what cost? Hi guys, welcome back. Thank you so much for being here. It's so greatly appreciated. It truly, truly is. Before we get started, let me give you my usual disclaimer. This video is for educational purposes only. Please do not take what I say as fact. Please always do your own research and come to your own conclusions. Next, if you have not liked, subscribed, or commented yet, please consider doing so because it really helps me out and I really, really appreciate it. He suggests that Justa allows the men to deflower her daughter, telling Justa that men would pay a lot of money to have the chance to take her daughter's virginity. A virginity that would be taken multiple times if they wanted to keep making good money off of it. But even more shocking than the owner making these crazy requests for Juana was the fact that her mother never bat an eyelash at this idea. She thought it was genius. The only demand, she needed to be in the room while these men were taking advantage of her daughter, basically. Because see, in Juana's mother's mind, there was nothing wrong with this. She had been having sex with men from a younger age than her daughter was even at that time. Plus, if she refused to allow these men to have their way with Juana, she feared that she would be kicked out on the streets again. After almost 2 years of dealing with men taking advantage of her, Juana became almost robot-like in nature. She also never dared to discuss these feelings with her mother because her mother didn't necessarily believe in talking about one's feelings. She preferred to drown her sorrows in drugs and alcohol instead. And that's just another example of how how Juana was forced to be silenced as a child. So, I've said this before and I'll say it again. My heart is broken for Juana the child. She did not deserve the things that happened to her in her young life. No child deserves that. Juana the adult, she's a whole nother story. One evening, Justa was at the bar hanging out, having some drinks and chatting with one of her regulars. A few drinks in, the client proposes that in exchange for the beer that he had just bought her, he proposed to call it even if Justa would allow him to have Juana permanently. Justa actually agrees to this proposal, telling Juana that she will have a much better life with Jose than she would ever have with her. She also advised Juana that she should plan on getting pregnant as quickly as possible if she wanted to keep having Jose give her a nice, cushiony life. Could you imagine your mom telling you that? A year later, Justa went over to the home of Juana and Jose for a visit. 13-year-old Juana told her mother that she had been feeling sick lately. It would turn out that Juana was feeling sick because she was pregnant. And by coincidence, she was the same age that her mother was when she gave birth to her. When Juana asked her mother if she could get rid of the baby, Justa was furious. She told her daughter in no uncertain terms that she would need to continue living with the old man, have this baby, and have him support the two of them for the rest of their lives. Just days after discovering that she was pregnant with her first child, Juana would suffer a miscarriage. Justa is furious when Juana tells her that she lost the baby, but it's where the anger came from that's even more disturbing. Justa was promised extra money by Jose if Juana had his child. So, not only did you pimp out your daughter, but you also pimped out your unborn grandchild. Jose would take pity on 13-year-old Juana and told her that she could stay with him, going on to remind her, though, that she would have to begin trying for another baby sooner rather than later, if not immediately. It would take another 3 years of misery, but at the age of 16, Juana would get pregnant again with Jose's baby. She actually kept tight-lipped about this pregnancy for a while before Justa began picking up on telltale signs of pregnancy. At her mother's insistence, Juana told Jose that she was pregnant for a second time. But just a couple weeks later, she would miscarry this baby as well. Except this time, Jose wasn't as understanding as he was the first time, and he kicked Juana out of the home. With nowhere else to go, Juana went back to the brothel to live and work with her mother for a second time. When Justa found out that Juana lost the second baby, she was furious at her. But instead of comforting her very young, very hurt, very traumatized child, she told her that God took the baby from her as a punishment because she didn't go to church enough. Bitch, I think your ass needs to go to church more because you're also not very godly. Juana begged her mother to let her stay with her, and Justa agreed, but under one condition. Juana had to agree to pretend that she and Justa were sisters when they were working, because apparently men will pay more if they believe that they're getting sisters. On top of this, she also had to agree to give Justa all of the money that she earned from working at the brothel. With no other choice, Juana reluctantly agrees. Juana would describe this part of her life as miserable. She would lay on the bed and close her eyes while men did what they did, whatever they wanted basically to her. And while this is going on, she would think about the two babies that she lost and how happy they must be in heaven. When the men were done, she would smile at them in hopes of getting a tip, but this rarely happened. And whatever money she did make from the men were given straight to her mother, who would split it with the owner of the brothel. So, to put it in perspective, Juana was sleeping with around 6 men a night, handing over all the money to her mother, who was splitting it with the owner, and the mother would take her cut and blow it on drugs and alcohol at a rapid pace. By the time Juana reached her early 20s, she was severely damaged, physically, emotionally, and mentally, and probably spiritually also. She was constantly being told that if she hadn't lost those babies, that both she and her mother would have had a much better life. Juana had become so broken down at this point that she truly believed her only way out of this brothel was going to have to be inside a wooden box. It would end up being another few years before Juana would finally be able to find some peace. And that peace would come only when her mother would succumb to her disease of cirrhosis of the liver. Luckily, Juana was smart enough to hide some of the client's money from her mother, which in turn allowed her to stash away some cash. Not a lot of cash, but enough to start a new life in Mexico City and away from the brothel. Juana, who had little to no education, worried about how she would continue to live once her tiny savings ran out. With no real skills, she had dreams of finding a rich man to fall in love with her, marry her, and take care of her for the rest of her life, which is pretty much what her mother taught her. What Juana ended up marrying instead was an unemployed alcoholic who expected her to go to work. The marriage was doomed from the start, and Juana would soon find herself a single mother of two now, living in a tiny apartment in an incredibly poor and dangerous section of Mexico City. So it shouldn't come as a shock to anyone that she wasn't getting child support from her baby daddy. She was truly alone at this point, but now with two more mouths to feed. Juana refused to go back to working at the brothel, but with little to no skills, where was she going? Where was she going to go job-wise? And even if she did find a job, how much money would she be making? Almost certainly not enough to keep the three of them afloat. So Juana decided to resort to petty theft. She would shoplift food and clothes from nearby stores, and this seemed to be helping out until she got arrested. Luckily for her, though, the judge heard her story, felt bad for her and the kids, so he let her go. Truth be told, I probably would have done the same thing in a heartbeat, no questions asked. Because at this point, remember, she still hasn't done anything. She hasn't done any real crimes other than the petty theft. So nobody knew what she really was capable of. Jobless, broke, and alone, a very depressed Juana began watching a lot of television. She got incredibly hooked on a Mexican form of masked professional wrestling. She would study the wrestlers day and night. She would learn all of their moves, and she would even try to predict who was going to win. This obsession of Juana's would come full circle for her one day when she was chatting with a neighbor. She figured out that wrestling might be a great way for her to release some of the stress that she's been feeling. So she signs up for membership at a local gym and she begins training. She's also able to persuade the neighbor who told her about this whole thing to begin with to train her as well. She agrees, the neighbor agrees, but tells Juana that the first order of business needs to be to form a persona, telling her that it's necessary to do that first before she can expect to be taken seriously in the world of professional wrestling. And so was born La Dama del Silencio, the Silent Lady. Her wardrobe consisted of a butterfly mask, a t-shirt, and striped pink leggings under baggy shorts. The very first time Juana went out to wrestle, the male audience members began to mock her and make fun of her. They were used to female wrestlers being much more sexy than Juana was. This ended up being an advantage for Wanda, though, because it set her apart from all the other female wrestlers. Then, one night, an opponent ripped Juana's butterfly mask off her face, and the audience went nuts. They began making fun of her face and questioning her sexuality, saying that she was very masculine. So I guess that means she must be gay, right? No, that's not what that means. Juana has always felt resentment and hatred, really, for most people, but after all of this started, it was magnified to dangerous proportions. Also, during this time, Juana is pregnant with her third baby. She never tells the promoters, though, because she's too scared of being fired. So, when it's time to cool things off in preparation for baby, Juana fakes an injury in order to get that time off. But after she goes back to wrestling, things didn't get better. In fact, they just got worse. She was typically a last minute fill in, which meant that if her name did appear on the playbill, it was going to be in very tiny font. Most of the fans didn't even know who she was, and because she mainly kept to herself, the wrestling world as a whole didn't really know much about her. Side note though, if you're going to be a serial, this is probably a good thing to do leading up to it, right? While all of this was going on, Juana would become pregnant now with her fourth baby. So, once again, as it was getting close to giving birth, promoters were getting pissed off that she wasn't performing well. Promoters also stopped paying her as much, and it was very clear to Juana that her wrestling career was fading fast. So, after the birth of her fourth child, Juana decided to give up the wrestling gig and go back to petty theft. But after almost getting caught twice, she decided it would be safer if she robbed homes during the day while people were at work. Her first two robberies go super smooth, and Juana gets a bunch of jewelry she's able to sell. Then, during her third home invasion, the owner ended up being home and began shooting at. So Juana sees that the owners So Juana sees that the owner is home and she escapes out a back door. And as she's running away, the owner of the house is shooting at her. She didn't get anything that time, by the way. So, scared of getting caught, Juana hangs up her criminal hat for a few weeks. But now she's jobless and penniless once again. That's when she gets friendly with a broke neighbor who is also a single mom. They put their very small brains together, and the best that they can come up with is to buy nurses' costumes, get fake credentials, and rob little old ladies who are home alone during the day. And for the next couple years, Juana and her accomplice would rob more than a dozen homes and never get caught. It also helped that the victims didn't even realize that they'd been robbed until the thieves were already gone. November 25th, 2002, Juana and her accomplice convinced 64-year-old Maria Gonzalez Naya to let them into her home. Maria soon realizes what was really going on, yells at Juana and her accomplice, grabs the phone, and threatens to call police. Juana becomes so enraged at the thought of having the police called on her that she grabs a vase and she smashes it over Maria's head. When Maria falls to the floor, Juana kneels down next to her, puts her hands around her throat, and you can figure out what happens next. After she's gone, the two women prop her body onto the couch in an attempt to make it look like she has died from natural causes. They grab what they wanted and they leave the apartment. So this would have been a great idea in theory, right? Except for the marks from the vase that was smashed over her head and the marks that were present around her throat. Oh my God. You can't fix stupid. Juana would later say that she didn't feel many emotions at all after her first. She had learned as a child to disassociate from emotions quite easily, actually. And Juana and her accomplice would soon decide that getting rid of their victims would be much safer for them in terms of not wanting to get caught. The problem with the police in Mexico City is this: they are overwhelmed with crimes, overworked, short staffed, and underpaid. Juana knew that this would work to her advantage when it came to launching police investigations, and she was very correct. The two women laid low for a few days before deciding that it was time to rob a second, third, fourth, fifth, and so on. March 2nd, 2003, Juana and her accomplice enter the home of 84-year-old Romina Oropeza. Unable to find anything of value, the two women tied up the elderly woman and tortured her until she told them where the valuables were. Then she would, of course, suffer the same fate as everybody before her. Sometimes Juana used her stethoscope, and sometimes she used her bare hands. The one thing that was always consistent, though, was that Juana was always the killer, never the accomplice. Juana would later confess that after each one, she felt less and less guilty about them. They were also incredibly convinced that this way of doing things was the best way to ensure that they would never be caught. Throughout the rest of the year, Juana and her accomplice would go on to unalive at least 5 more women that police know about, with their last victim being unalived just 1 month before Christmas. It also became very clear very fast that the police were putting the unalivings of the little old ladies at the very bottom of their priority list. In the beginning of 2004, Juana took a stab at her professional wrestling career one more time, claiming she tried wrestling again in an attempt to stop the unalivings, but it never lasted very long. And every time that Juana would lose a fight in the ring, she would take it out on yet another innocent little old lady. A year after Juana's unaliving spree had first started, Juana unalived another 15 elderly women. Police were convinced that they were looking at least 2 professional male serial killers, never ever considering that the killers could be a female. It's also important to note that prior to Juana, Mexico had never had a female serial. It wasn't until 2005 when Juana and her accomplice talked their way into the home of 92-year-old Maria Hernandez, who Juana with a scarf after she refused to tell them where the jewelry was hidden, that police began taking the crimes a little more seriously. Following the death of Maria, police concluded that whoever was responsible was able to talk their way into the homes. While this was helpful, it did little to nothing in terms of narrowing down the search. A criminologist would conclude that because 3 of the women owned expensive paintings, this is a good one, that the must be highly intelligent, highly sophisticated, and incredibly difficult to catch. During a press release, Mexican authorities said that the person they're looking for is a man dressed as a woman. They're white, around 5'6", robust complexion, light brown, oval face, wide cheeks, blonde hair, and around 45 years of age. Second profile that was released was fairly accurate, minus the part about it being a male. Police believe is a man with homosexual preferences, a victim of child abuse, has resentment from a grandmother or elderly female friend, and resentment towards that figure. When the press began questioning if it could be a woman, Police responded by saying, in 1998, highly respected FBI profilers insisted that there are no female serial. By this point, Juana was feeling the stress of being a mother to four, wrestling, and being a serial killer. But it wouldn't be until Juana's 24-year-old son is and unalive during a robbery. After the death of her son, Juana grew even more hateful, and that hate was now spread out even further. She began laying low during this time because not only was she still grieving the death of her son, but she had also fallen out with her accomplice. Then, in October of 2005, Mexican authorities had a press release telling the public that they believe has unalived themselves because there hasn't been a little old lady in an entire year. It's during this release that Juana realizes the police were nowhere near solving this case. This gave her the safety net that she needed to decide to again. So in November of 2005, Juana decides it's time to strike. She talked her way into the home of 82-year-old Carmen Miguel. She tied Carmen up, but when Carmen refused to tell her where the valuables were, she does what she does. Carmen turned out to be the mother of a very well-respected criminologist who demanded the police find the person responsible for his mother's death. Juana begins to become concerned after the death of Carmen, and she's beginning to regret it. But after a few months of police not solving the case, Juana decides it's time to strike again. This time would prove to be one too many, though. Finally, she entered the home of 84-year-old Ana Alfaro. But this time, a tenant that's renting a room from her saw Juana fleeing the scene before she discovered her dead landlord. When police arrived at the house, the witness was able to give them a pretty detailed description. And when Juana discovered the police sirens, she didn't run, she didn't hide, she just stood there and she was ready for this part of her life to be over. When police searched her home, they found several trophies from the victims' homes. Trophies that included family photos and silverware. January 25th, 2006, Juana is formally charged with the death of between 42 and 48 women, dubbing her Mexico's first solo female serial. There was no mention of Juana's accomplice for a majority of the deaths. March 31st, 2008, Juana is found guilty of 16 charges of unaliving and aggravated burglary, and she's sentenced to 759 years in prison. Because sentences in Mexican jails are served concurrently, the most Juana will serve in prison is 60 years. This will make her more than 100 years old by the time she's eligible for parole. So that's refreshing to the people of Mexico, obviously. After they lock her up and they throw away the key, for the most part, the people of Mexico stop thinking about, worrying about, or caring about Juana. That is until 2015, when she would make headlines once again for marrying an extremely dangerous inmate who was in the men's section of her prison and who had courted her through letters for quite some time. Juana and Miguel were dating for about a year when they exchanged vows in prison along with 48 other couples. It's all part of this prison program called Bonds in Confinement, which allows inmates to forge relationships with each other. Prison officials also provided food, music, and cake during a reception. I'm sorry, aren't these people supposed to be getting punished? Prior to the wedding day, the couple had never seen each other in person, and shortly after the wedding, the whole relationship and now marriage had fallen apart. It went to complete shit. During the first and only year of their marriage, they only saw each other 3 times for a total of 40 minutes. So, just 1 year into the marriage, Juana files for divorce. It is said that these days she laughs about her incredibly short marriage. All right, guys, if you're still here, thank you, thank you, thank you. I love you and I appreciate you so, so, so very much. Please like, subscribe, and comment if you haven't yet and you feel so inclined to, because it really helps me out and I really appreciate it. And until next time, stay safe out there.